Hello and welcome to the iTnews podcast. Our guest this fortnight is Thales CISO for Australia and New Zealand and RSA Conference CISO Bootcamp co-chair, Ben Doyle. The bootcamp is in its second year in Australia, running ahead of CyberCon in Melbourne this week, and aims to build future CISO skills to help them make the transition into a security executive role. Ben draws upon his experiences to discuss some of those important skill sets. He also touches on where to next for the bootcamp. Just to start with, I guess, it might be useful just to understand a little bit about the CISO bootcamp itself, and maybe you can just give us a bit of an introduction to the bootcamp and how it came about.
The bootcamp itself is actually a program that is run by the RSAC conference. I actually reached back to them. The first one they held was in 2019, and it was actually modeled over a different program, which is a closed forum for CISOs. But this was about how do we train the next lot of CISOs. They now run multiple boot camps for CISOs in America, in London, but when they thought about bringing it to Australia, they decided to partner with AISA because so many people turned up CyberCon, and AISA is about also trying to enhance the ecosystem and scaling up within Australia. Why I got involved last year, which was the first time they did it in Melbourne, it was in fact the first time RSA conference that actually run the boot camp outside of America also, was because I have a fair amount of history with the RSA conference anyway. So I knew the organisers there, and plus I have a fair amount of history within AISA also. And so when I got wind of it, I basically grabbed it. It was something I was interested in. I said, I could actually do this. I know all the players, and I actually have a bit of a passion to try and give back and try and learn from my journey. Obviously, I've had a very long journey in the industry also on what are some of the things new CISOs need to understand that they probably don't naturally understand, especially if they're coming from a technical, operational mindset when they're moved into a CISO role.
When you talked about this on LinkedIn last year, you mentioned wanting to cover off topics that many new CISOs, especially coming from the operations or technical side, would not perhaps readily understand as pivotal to their success in that transition. To me, that implies a little bit of that classic leap from sort of technology to management. So I imagine a CISO to some extent remains on the tools. What are some of the skills or capabilities that you see as being critical in that step up?
One of the big things I drove last year, which I'm going to drive very solidly this year, is peer network. Technicians do have some network sometimes. It's not the default, I don't think, because they're so operationally focused. They don't really look externally as many times. However, especially when you go into that management CISO, your trusted peer network is probably your best capability, not only from a threat intelligence, because guess what? The best threat intelligence you'll get is the stuff you don't pay for. You'll get a lot quicker than other things once you build that network. But it's also what I call data group therapy sometimes, because when you want to vet, at least you have a group of people who understand potentially what you're going through, because cyber is hard. It's unique like any other skilled profession. Unless you're doing it day in, day out, you don't really understand the stresses and the frustrations. So having people you can actually talk to is actually quite good and reach out, even in some cases where others may decide they need a move. And so you trust to say, hey, I've got itchy feet. If you hear anything in the next 6 to 9 months, let me know. And there's a bit of that closed network of, rather than going through the whole career, you can actually introduce and recommend various people, because at the CISO level, we all have headhunters tap on the shoulders every now and then. And while we may not be wanting to jump, if we know some of our peers may have itchy feet, they can recommend it. That's obviously a good thing we can do and basically share between each other. So that network is probably a key one that most people don't realize, I think, is going to be so powerful through their career. And probably the other thing, because it does become stressful, you have the mental health aspects, which is, okay, look after yourself. It is going to be a stressful job. How do you look after yourself? And the other side of it, which comes off a bit of the networking, which is how do you change your communication? Communication tech versus communication business is very different. And you got to communicate to more non-technical people than technical people when you're at CISO level to be successful.
You mentioned stresses there a couple of times. How do the stresses change when you transition from an operational or technical role into more of a CISO role?
I think if you step back and look at it, and obviously when you're in a technical role, a lot of the stress will come from deployments and stuff like that. But realistically, where the real stress comes from is incident response. Under those conditions, I actually enjoy that sort of stress. As long as it's short term and not long stress, I can actually get a lot of benefit out of that. But I think the difference is when you're dealing with tech, it is very logical. It is very black and white. You're either going to succeed or you're not going to succeed. You're in there trying to solve a challenge or a problem. I think when you get into the executive, it's not as black and white because you're dealing with all sorts of other side threads that you may not be an expert in, which are a lot more gray potentially. and which has a different language in some cases. And it's very hard to explain potentially what the issue is, and the expectations are very different in some cases. So if you have to lean down into the legal, or if you have to lean down into public relations, communications, or business risks and stuff like that, the expectations, I think, is very different, because there's no case of you're either going to succeed or you're not in terms of from a technical point of view, versus you're trying to almost, convince people that something's under control, even though the other person has no idea what's going on. So it's a harder mental model to be in.
How do you recognize someone as future CISO material? What sort of characteristics or traits or skills do they typically possess already that then when they go through the boot camp, they're able to build on?
It's generally a case of how long have you been in the industry? Have you held tech management roles or even management roles elsewhere, and you're just doing a side transition? It feels like from a career point of view that at some point, in probably the next 12 to 18 months, if they haven't transitioned, they'll be in some form of cyber executive role. And the interesting one, I guess, this year we're grappling with also is if you're a vendor, so an MSSP or an advisory person and a senior person there, should they attend the bootcamp also? Which we have actually opened it up to them, because we had that recognition. So Grant McKechnie and myself, the coaches, had that recognition saying they still serve a lot of organizations. And therefore, if we're trying to present, okay, as a CISO, you should be managing and leading this way, they have an aspect to all organizations also throughout the business that may not be able to get a CISO themselves. And so they go to the advisory services by the MSSPs. So why shouldn't we be training those in terms of what our behaviors and cultures and values are as a cyber community? And so that's why we broadened some of the acceptance this year.
That's interesting as well, I think, because I've heard from more than one CISO that perhaps an underrated skill set is having some background in consultancy or some experience on that side of the business, as well as more internal focused. I don't know what your perspective is on that as well.
I think it comes with the experience you get from an advisory, especially if you're doing cyber executive advisory, because you're dealing with a number of organizations at the executive level, with the CIO level, but generally potentially be the CFO or CRO. You start to understand the communication methods and the ways of thinking. And so they've got almost a more natural path into the CISO, where they don't have to do that shift of, okay, how do I need to change my communication? How do I need to change my way I talk and the way I present risk when dealing with executives? I can see where that thought process would actually work quite well.
Something you mentioned earlier in the conversation as well, that you are particularly interested in this idea of paying it forward in terms of developing that next generation of CISOs. Do you want to talk a little bit about things that you can bring to the table in terms of developing that next generation?
I've had a very unique role with Thales, been there for now 21 years in this role. But just because of the history of what we are, so nationally, and I'm very open about it, is in Australia, we're a large defence industry player, but we're French, so therefore we're not far of us. And especially when we look 20, 21 years back, there was a natural bias of, can we trust the French with our customer when it comes to national security? And that's part of what Thales pushed my role and my peers' role, the CISO's role, into making sure we're engaged externally to ensure we have, or would show that, yes, we're fully engaged and we're actually trying to lead when it comes to security in this country. So that's probably on a various path in terms of being able to explore and actually be quite open in terms of talking externally. Because naturally I'm an introvert, I don't like talking. It's just, I've trained myself to talk quite a bit. But because I now had that experience over the last 21 years, and I'm very comfortable with my role, I'm very open to be able to go out and actually present and say, okay, this is what I expect from a cyber community, our values and our behaviors should be, which will then obviously translate into longer term culture. We're a very young community when you think about it, very young profession. So we need to be shaping what our future is going to be as a community. The problem is, because we're young, we don't have that many leaders yet to look at as people come into the industry of what are the standard behaviors and values that we want to be. I have that freedom from an internal comms point of view to be able to go out and talk quite freely around that. And therefore, because I have that freedom and because I spent so much time in the community, I want to be able to give back. So that's part of what I can give back, is go out and talk about, okay, this is what I believe from my history that our values, our behaviors from this community should be. This is what I've learned. In some cases, I can do that quite a bit in terms of, okay, this is my history. You may find value or not. And if you don't, fantastic, because that might be a start of a really good conversation. I actually prefer someone who may not agree with me, because generally I might learn something there also. And it's not going to be the world according to Ben Doyle. Which is why basically I brought a coach into the bootcamp this year. Is I didn't want the bootcamp to become a bootcamp of how Ben thinks all CISOs should be, and they'll continue for the next number of years. I actually want the chairs to actually cycle over. So I'll probably step away from the bootcamp next year so that fresh blood can come in and help set that agenda on, okay, this is how we think leadership should actually be trained.
I don't think you'd be the first CISO to go to a conference or any kind of gathering and say, I want to be challenged. I think that's a fairly common theme and mindset across the profession. Just on your tenure as a CISO, it's very much outside the regular tenure that perhaps you associate with CISOs. You mentioned, obviously, it's a young profession, though, so it's not necessarily a profession that's been around for an extended period of time to have that many people that would have been in those kind of roles for a long time. But to be around for that long, you've obviously seen a lot and you've had to evolve your skill sets as well. How have you seen the CISO role change over that time? And how does that influence the way you approach the skills development conversation within the bootcamp side of things?
I think it probably goes back to I've had that unique path because I was so early in Australia with the CISO title. And realistically, probably thinking back then, there probably was the 4 banks and Telstra at that stage that may have had the CISO title. I can't even think it goes back 2003 to 2006 period. And then there was a big gap. Realistically, there was other CISOs that came in, but it was the top end of town. It was only, I think, really the rise of ransomware and the impact to the business that you saw businesses recognizing they needed an executive level cybersecurity person, which is really where I think you saw the mass uplift within the Australian market in terms of CISOs. But when I look back in terms of my career progression, as the business grew up with the internet, email suddenly wasn't a thing you needed to approve for. Everyone got email. Internet was, okay, we're moving from 1 meg to suddenly everyone has 100 meg to suddenly everyone has gigabit. So the internet spread and came along with a lot of cultural problems within organizations, which defaulted to the CISO and conversations that you had to have with HR and legal and stuff like that. I guess it's looking at some of those challenges and how I've solved them and some of the experiences I've learned around them. How do I give those people coming to the boot camps? The way I say it is, I don't try to train or expect people to learn everything in that one day. It's impossible. What I'm trying to do is give them a nugget that stays in the back of their head. So if they hit a certain situation in the next 3 to 5 years, they at least know what direction they have to run and gives them a head start rather than sitting going, I don't know how to deal with this problem or have no context because there's no way they're going to remember. So if I can get at least 1 or 2 nuggets in the back of their heads, which means it's going to solve a problem they know how to approach in the future, then I think there's value in that boot camp, let alone building obviously that peer network. A lot of it is the themes I talked about earlier, which is obviously communication. You've got to be a very strong communicator. You have to be only the confidence, but it's also the stress. You will come up with very stressful situations. And one of the big lessons I've learned, and I was lucky enough very early in my tenure, was I had a very hard and difficult 18 months. But coming out of that, I learned what my stresses were. So when going into similar situations, I could actually mediate when I was getting too stressful. And then either start delegating more or giving me permission to actually drop low priority things. And so if you're overburdened, that sometimes it is all right to actually drop some low priority things because it's probably more important to do those high priority things of case, and you're not failing when you do that. And that's a very hard lesson to go through, A, to learn your stresses, but B, to then give you permission to fail. Because unfortunately, when you think about the personality types in many cases that go into cyber, it's the same as emergency management and stuff like that. We're firefighters, essentially. We're mission driven with firefighters. We want to solve the problems. We don't want to fail. And it's a very hard lesson to say, yes, it's all right to fail sometimes.
What's the ambition for the boot camp? Is there a specific goal in mind? How do you see it developing?
The ambition from my point of view, because obviously I've spent 2 years in this, is that it continues. I think it's actually a great program. The feedback we get, especially from last year's alumni, was extremely positive. The challenge coins we use, because I changed the use of that, it's been quite successful where each of the alumni, if they need a peer as a priority, have a conversation or just a catch up, they can basically produce the coin. And that peer has to make it a priority, a high priority, to actually meet them or have that conversation, rather than just having a challenge coin for turning up to a boot camp. That actually has worked quite well, whereas actually re-established some of those connections over the last 12 months with that coin. So seeing that continue, there's something special for that boot camp. I think it'd be quite cool to continue. One of the things we are doing is, again, going to that networking point, we run a signal group for some of the alumni. There's a quarter of them on there. And I actually have as part of the, I think it's the second agenda item this time, is we have a panel of 4 of those alumni to actually start the day off. Then it's about talking about what they got out of it last year, and what their journey has been since, and what was the real valuable lessons. It's just trying to prep the incoming attendees for the day to be open-minded and see the value. But I think that's where hopefully we'll be able to morph some of that alumni group longer term to try bring in some of the agenda setting in the future to feed it. Because one of the big feedbacks last year we're trying to address a bit this year is obviously I focused on the big end of town because that's what I know. And I actually tried to put speakers that you wouldn't normally get access to because sometimes people are more open to that thought process. But the problem and one of the feedbacks of that is if I'm a small council size, I'm not sure how I take all these big things and wrap it into where I'm the CISO, I'm the IT manager and I have a restricted budget. How do I take my learnings and deal with that tomorrow? So some of that feedback started to come through, which we're trying to address. And I'm hoping that's where we can build that networking community from the bootcamp alumni to start shaping what that future education may be. What I'd like to do, and again, it'll be up to what AISA and RSAC wants to do in the future if I do step back, is the reason I brought on the co-chair, as I said, is I think it needs to change year on year in terms of what's being presented. So I'd expect the co-chair this year, Grant McKechnie, hopefully will be able to be just the chair next year. So he basically designed it as he would want it, with the expectation the following year he brings on a co-chair, which is basically the training of how you run a boot camp. So then they can take it on and just every 2 years, basically, someone gets a chance to design it how they want to do it before they head and prepare for the next one. And I think that sort of model should hopefully mean that we have a good program that can be sustainable over time.
That's the episode for this fortnight. For all the latest headlines and happenings in Australian technology news, head over to itnews.com.au.